Welcome, everybody. This is a panel discussion that we're going to have that will just look at how performance is useful, if you like, within interactive games. I mean, maybe that sounds very straightforward and obvious, but today already people have identified lots and lots of different ways in which performance is important, and I think it's worth another look at, if you like. So, you know, the Nerd Pirates and Kim talked about, you know, improv theater, and Yoko Taro talks about the context and emotion and how that's created. I think it's a good time to look at this again. And what we're going to do here is just talk very briefly and quickly each, and then maybe bring you all in to have a bit more of a chat about some of the stuff that you've seen today and what all that kind of means. Okay, so the people on our panel, I'm just going to do a quick share of a presentation just to keep me on target, to be honest with you. Okay, so these are the people we have today. Oh, sorry, I'll just start from the beginning. Okay, so here we have the people today. We have David Negrin, Che John Rose Adams, and Alex Kelly and myself. Each of us come from a different background. People like David are writers, game designers. Che is a games person, but also very engaged in sort of visual culture. John Rose Adams runs a scheme called XR Stories that is run from York University. Alex Kelly is a theatre director and has his own theatre company, and I'm a screenwriter. So we come at this from very different angles, and we'll each be saying very different things about how performance is important. So I'm kind of kicking off with a context. So we're thinking about, you know, there's an awful lot of people sort of saying things like, you know, is this the end of storytelling? Or, you know, is it something new and different that we have to do? But as lots of the speakers have said today, yes, it is exciting and interesting and different, but it also uses kind of methods coming from many different places. So, and I think in that sense, we can look back to some performance notions, theories, processes, whatever way you want to look at that. You know, think about how useful they are. And mostly, I think this is about how audiences take part. So we're used to some taking part already in lots of different ways. Now, I come from film and TV, so I'm going to just talk about it from that point of view. You know, so we vote, or we send stuff in, or there are extensions to programs like Sherlock that allow us to sort of delve deeper into those things. But not all of those have any impact on the narrative. Or sort of allow people to get involved. And not all really offer meaningful moments for audiences, although some do, and not all intend to either. So, you know, there are different reasons for this, but I think what performance processes can offer is a more sort of immediate and meaningful involvement. And of course, you know, there's loads of that that's been talked about today, like in role-playing games. And, you know, some of these film and TV type scenarios have been successful and some have really failed. And often, certainly in the UK, quite a number of people were interested in this, let's say around 2008, but then very quickly people sort of lost interest in how people can get involved and how they can take part and how they can perform. You know, and the sort of the long running series kind of took over. But I think for me, that's often down to the fact that there isn't very much for people to do in these things, or that it's not very intuitive. And obviously games is different to that. So, we'll come to talk about that in a bit, but also, the audience is never quite sure what they can do and how they can get involved. So there's some things I think that are interesting. So I've taken part in some of these things. So Swamp Hotel is a kind of escape roomy type drama thing. And that was really interesting. It's very like the Sherlock experience. And that kind of brought you into a story, but gave you lots of clues and things to solve along the way. We will hear later from Bernie Sue, and he's talking about using Twitch and how he does that to bring the audience in. And the Royal Shakespeare Company did a very interesting thing called Dream. And I think what's interesting about that was not so much the way in which the audience got involved, but that we got to see the mechanism behind the dream, and somehow that involved us in a big way, and that involved us, that kind of got us to perform, if you like. But one of the things that kind of interests me, and there's a company called Blast Theory, who there's a picture there of a production that they did that was about becoming an undercover sort of person. But one of the things doing it that I found, because I'm a writer and I don't really like performing, was how scary the performance piece was. But they got around that by showing us how to do it to a degree. And that's another aspect that I'm interested in. So these are the reasons why I think it's interesting to look at performance processes in this interactive context, to see how we can deal with power, how we can shift that around. I think we'll always tell stories. There will always be authors, and different stories require different things. But I think giving people much more control and sort of agency, I suppose, but being able to input their own thoughts and feelings into the productions is kind of what people are after. So I'm interested in how writers and creators become performers, if you like, in terms of how they deal with that in making information available, but also how to audiences perform. So I'm going to hand it over now to Alex, who is quite interested by this notion of audiences as experts, but also audiences as people who can put their own experiences into the work. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Anna. I am going to swap over and share my screen. Hi, everybody. I'm Alex Kelly. I'm co-artistic director of a theatre company based in Sheffield called Third Angel, and I'm also a reader here at Leeds Beckett. Fascinating talks this morning. I had prepared some thoughts to say, and they've been overwritten a bit by wanting to respond to some of the brilliant speakers this morning. But then I thought I'd talk very briefly about how two of our projects illustrate some of the things I'm interested in. This is a project that hopefully you can see on your screens called The Desire Paths. So this is quite a few of our projects involve us creating a mechanism or a game that we can play, and a passing audience will wonder what we're doing and discover, if they come and inquire, that they can sort of join in. So with the Desire Paths, we go to a town or a city and we chalk out a giant map of the town centre on the stone of the town. This is in York. That's a 10 metre by 12 metre map of York that as a team, the performers are in the red dungarees, if you hadn't guessed that. And when people walk past and wonder what we're doing, we sort of collar them and say, would you like to know what we're doing? And talk to them a bit about why streets are named, who gets to name the streets. And then we invite that audience member to rename a street of their town on our map after a hope or a dream or an ambition they have for the future. And what we've discovered through creating this work a number of times is that people are really up for that invitation, but what they also want to do is they want to name a street that is significant for them, and then what they want to do is tell you a story about why they're choosing that street. And the reason I want to talk about this project is when Anna and I and the rest of the panel had a sort of a pre-meeting maybe a month ago. Anna said a great thing about the audience not being trained to perform necessarily. And in this instance, with a project like this, they didn't even know they were going to be an audience, a lot of them, and they didn't necessarily know, even when they came over to look at something, that they were going to be asked to participate. And what we've discovered is it's about finding the mechanism that doesn't, people don't feel obliged to join in. Sometimes with audience participation, you can feel like you're going to get picked on, or you're sort of obliged to join in, otherwise the show is going to break or the project is going to break. Whereas with this, there's a sort of a double invitation that, do you have a hope or a dream for the future you'd like to commemorate with a street name? But also, is there a street you've lived on that you'd like to tell us about, is the sort of the implied question. And what we discover is that people do want to know what's going on. It's really good for families and individuals walking past, and they really want to have a chat. And we are working from these sort of A3 scale maps that we are translating to the much bigger map. So it is quite a difficult task that we're trying to do, that some people are interested in, but people really want to translate the map, because we start with no map drawn, so people have to figure out where they are standing on the map and where their street is and whether we've drawn it yet. So people are really interested in looking at what we're working from. They really want to get the street right. These are in Bedford now, these images, and people really want to make sure they're naming the right road. And then what we've discovered is people, of course, they want to take a photograph of themselves standing on the street they've renamed, and they want to commemorate that. And they get given a title deed for the place they have renamed. And so these are just some of the names that the people in Bedford wanted to rename their streets. And this guy said, can I rename the prison? And our rule is, and so we discover how what we think of the rules get more defined the more we play. And our rule is, if it's named on the map, if it's named on the A to Z, because of the age I am, we work from the published street atlas rather than Google Maps. If it's named on the map, you can rename it on our chalk map. So he called HMP Bedford Freedom House. This little girl was imagining the immediate, this is an ambition for the very immediate future, and she knew it was an ambition she was going to get achieved because they'd just bought the ice cream that she was going to eat at home. So that's that project for us is about that mechanism that becomes an invitation, that people can just walk past, they can just listen to what's going on and then leave, but people often come back. But usually people, when they find out what's going on, they want to take part, and they want to see what other people have said. There's definitely a point on the first day. We usually spend 2 or 3 days drawing the map. There's a point on the first day where we've got enough street names where the map starts to tell its own story, and people can be invited to look at what other people have done. And because in these interactive performances, often people go, oh, I don't have any stories to tell you. So yeah. And I was just thinking on my run this morning, actually. I'm also a role-playing gamer, and I'm reading this rule set at the moment, Blades in the Dark. If you don't know it, as I came back to role-playing games recently, there's a real focus on the newer systems about them being joint storytelling mechanics. And there's a section in this where he talks about the point where in the collaborative storytelling, we introduce dice rolls to find out what's going to happen. And it made me think of this point in our performances where we invite an audience to contribute. And he talks about the author mode switches off and everyone becomes an audience member. So thinking about the nature of this panel, there's a point where as performers and makers, we then become an audience to the contribution the audience member is making. And I really enjoyed that exchange of power. I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Alex. That was great. We next have Che John, who's going to talk about emergent and temporal play in shared and physical network social media game space. So we're going to talk a bit more about games here.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Good, good. Yeah, because I'm on a not great mic today, so so hopefully it's picking up okay. Yeah, so yeah, that's really interesting talk. I mean, my talk primarily today is capturing some of those aspects of games and play, as well as how that applies within kind of storytelling context and audience context as well. And I'm going to sort of frame it by discussing two projects I've worked on in recent years that kind of engage with some of those ideas. So my background initially was as a games developer, and now work in education as a course director at Leeds Beckett University. I've been in education for the last 15 years or so now. But my background was kind of as a software developer, games developer, but also working as an artist. So a lot of my early work was sort of informed by some of the technologies and some of the media I was using, but it's always kind of involved participation by the audiences, either as kind of players who kind of play games kind of singularly. And if you think about sort of video games historically, over the last 25 years, that's kind of changed quite dramatically in terms of how you interact with games. And certainly sort of now in terms of like network scenarios. But also those kind of interactions between the player and the screen. So a lot of my early artwork was exploring that space, that idea of the screen space and interacting with it. So it's two of the projects I'm talking about are kind of in line with that. One was for a commissioned piece for Channel 4, and a more recent piece that was a gallery piece, and they're kind of both at different ends of the spectrum because they deal with different types of audiences. Those who are sort of coming through, say, like a TV broadcast network, and those who might come through an arts gallery space, for example, and interact with the kind of the technology and the media through that way. So I'll talk about the two projects, and kind of around that, kind of encapsulate the kind of framework for this. It's kind of like it's Twitter, kind of social engine, and kind of social media technology that was used in both examples as a kind of means to kind of drive content and engage with audiences. So the first one was a project called Geeks, and this was a commission piece that was commissioned by Channel 4, and the story and the show was developed by Naomi Alderman, who sort of worked on sort of Zombies Run. The premise of that show was it was set like in the north of England, and it was around a kind of community of gamers who kind of were tapping into the dark web. So it's kind of this weird kind of cultural, social aspect to it, and this kind of hidden internet aspect to it, and this idea of like social media, and the context of this, alongside the idea of this kind of game, was it kind of ran alongside a broadcast TV production. So it's about sort of doing the sort of start of this whole kind of TV second screen crossover set of activities. So they're very much kind of interested in how you can use a second screen like a phone or a tablet to interact with storytelling or narrative as kind of part of that process. So this was like a commission piece where you had the TV show broadcast on E4, and alongside that, in parallel, you had the social kind of game that you could sort of play alongside as part of extra content or extended content as part of the kind of the tablet experience or second screen experience. So part of that commissioning process, kind of trying to develop a game idea around that, and I guess it was like a fairly open brief. We had the idea of the story, sort of met with the writer, met with the producers, and the idea was to try to sort of build an interactive game on top of that that's going to engage the audiences through this idea of the second screen. So the game I devised was this kind of effectively like a top trumps game that uses kind of social media as its kind of driving engine. So this idea of kind of, I suppose, what's popular, so popularity, and Twitter, and what's kind of trending, was kind of also like a cultural kind of sort of a cultural framework for how these kind of this group of young people worked and engaged within their own kind of subculture, but also connecting with kind of how popularity works, and certainly for social media and kind of what trends. So the idea was, if you now thought top trumps works, it's kind of highest wins effectively. So the idea was that the kind of game's engine or the game's mechanics or rules kind of based around what was kind of most popular at that kind of given time on social media, but that sort of also ran alongside the sort of TV show. So things that might be sort of trending in the TV show would also potentially have sort of traction within the app. So part of this kind of, I mean, one thing that's kind of really useful and interesting to me, at least when sort of trying to describe this, is kind of, I guess, discussing some of the technology and the process as well. Kind of it just helps kind of demystify some of that a little bit, and just kind of helps understand how audience kind of do participate and how to engineer that, and how to sort of design around that. So part of that kind of first process was kind of to create this kind of paper prototype and sort of kind of work out the rule system. So you might sort of see here, you kind of got three strands, or sort of three categories, and they were kind of that sort of live data from Twitter. So I wrote an API that effectively sort of scrapes. So an API is like an application that was pulling data out of Twitter, what's kind of trending, and I use that sort of data to populate those kind of three attributes for those cards. So imagine a simple card game populated by real live data that's trending, and that data would effectively translate into points in terms of kind of what you could use in your kind of your battle context. So part of that process, trying to work out how that would work as a mechanic. So I sort of did it in paper first, built around this idea of this engine. So I built the kind of the software part of that, kind of just try to pull data from Twitter. So it kind of got live data as part of that. So we had something called a PS score. So that's popularity score. And that kind of so if you sort of typed in like Lady Gaga, for example, it would sort of tell us kind of how frequently that was sort of trending within hours, days, or weeks of like a sort of given time period. So you can use that sort of data to sort of populate how popular something might have been at that given time, and that will kind of sort of give data to the cards. Alongside that, it's kind of visualization. So we also try and keep it simple. So because it was a card game, Top Trumps, it kind of, I think most people sort of know how to play that inherently as a kind of like a kind of a simple game system. So it seems kind of the easiest way to build this kind of game around it. So again, we did some kind of art, kind of a concept team. So this is some of the early kind of concept work produced by the art studio who worked with us. Again, it's kind of initial kind of wireframing. Again, sort of trying to create something which was portable, because again, we're sort of producing stuff for mobile devices. And one of the things I wanted to kind of try to address was kind of the barriers for entry, and making sure that it was kind of accessible. So like the lowest tech was like the kind of target platform, so mobile phones, or like your low spec PCs, so you can run this stuff in a browser effectively. So we sort of tried to be as inclusive as possible in terms of kind of some of the technology we're using, kind of make this kind of content available to kind of the widest audience. So again, some simple wireframes, kind of showing how it kind of works design-wise. So the kind of card system, selecting a card, that being populated by live data. So the 48 represents kind of what something's kind of what something's kind of trending. So it's like a power statistic, and then battling out between sort of two players. So those two players will be sort of two live players that sort of running sort of real time. So you have sort of two players participating at any given time using sort of live data and using that as their kind of rule system. And then one winner based on kind of what was trending and how you sort of selected your cards. So again, this idea of kind of characters in sort of the TV show and characters on the cards were kind of ran in parallel. So those kind of characters sort of came in and came out of the production. You'd have new cards taken out or added to sort of decks. So it kind of works as a kind of very dynamic sort of content sort of driven system, but driven by the audiences as well as kind of the TV program. I've got a short video piece. I'm going to show you which kind of illustrates it a little bit. And I won't show all of it because it's about 4 minutes long, but I'll kind of give you an idea how it looked, or the prototype looked at least anyway. So there's where you sort of selected your kind of card on the service. Then you might have picked like an attribute, Simpsons, as being your kind of attribute to kind of play against the other player. That gives you like a battle score based on what's trending. And then they're sort of battling it out until sort of Top Trump style kind of mechanic. So the highest kind of card wins, but you also sort of play different attributes off and sort of do like reverse systems. So you could have like special skills attached. But yeah, I won't play the whole thing. It goes on for a little bit, but it kind of shows how that kind of worked as a kind of demonstratable, proof of concept, but sort of also implementing it as a kind of as a working project. The second piece, Frictions of Distance, was an art gallery piece, and this was sort of producing in partnership with the cultural centre in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, and the work was sort of investigating this idea of network space and this idea of negotiate space in sort of gallery and public spaces. And I guess kind of because my kind of background in art design and arts practice is kind of more informed than that than say the kind of commercial strand of the work we're sort of doing. So this idea of kind of technology, sort of breaking down geography, this idea is this kind of postmodern notion of kind of global nomad society, sort of frictionless society where technology kind of mediates that ease of transition was like the basis for that project. The whole project was kind of part of a large gallery piece called Liminal, and investigated how kind of sort of diasporas across various communities kind of were connected by technology or media. But kind of with that idea of this idea of kind of barriers for entry, kind of what does it sort of take to kind of travel? It's kind of an interesting kind of question when you think about technology. What does it sort of take for you to kind of use that technology as a platform or vehicle to explore, expand, or move from a situation or move from where you are? And it's not always inclusive. It can do the opposite sometimes. So that was kind of the basis for this piece of work, and exploring the idea of having these two kind of live spaces, one in Cambodia, one in the UK, and how participants, the audience, kind of could use that as a kind of as a sort of narrative to tell their own stories in those two spaces that are completely different, completely ends of the spectrum in terms of kind of geography, as well as kind of cultural context, and how the technology sort of mediated that as a kind of arts piece. So the things we're exploring kind of ideas of how do you represent yourself in sort of digital space, the idea of the avatar, interaction in that space, and again using kind of gaming aspects, sort of gaming sort of language, I suppose, the kind of grammar of games is kind of part of that, because again it sort of informs itself a little bit, this idea of how you interact in a kind of social space, using kind of easy to assemble technology, kind of open source media as well. I mean, the whole idea that anybody can sort of build one of these bits of technology and use it as a kind of way to recreate and learn about sort of the Internet of Things or physical computing. So the whole thing was kind of designed around this principle that anybody can make this. And we ran some workshops alongside the exhibition as well. So the prototyping, setting up kind of the network, how it kind of works functionally as a system, kind of database, internet obviously in the middle, sensor input. And we use kind of these things called fidgets, which are kind of digital and analog sensors that we kind of built this kind of interactive carpet around. This is kind of something I built with the MA students. And again, it took about 3-4 months of kind of building and sort of rigorous testing to kind of make sure the thing kind of worked. So what you see there is like a matrix of connected sensors. So you walked across these sensors, and from there kind of worked out your proximity. So one of the things was kind of working out kind of how kind of define those interactions. If you sort of stepped across 2 areas, for example, and how that sort of got translated into an image or kind of location. So again, sort of some testing there of kind of the mapping. So we had a projector in a ceiling, and that had a sort of one-to-one relationship to the location on the interactive floor, effectively, these sensors. So as you walk across the floor, you kind of draw an object based on where you were. So this idea of, sort of proximity locally was really interesting, kind of where you are next to somebody in the gallery space, but also where you are in relation to somebody else on the other side of the world. So it worked in real time as well. So you can sort of have people in the same space virtually in this kind of connected floor space. But also this idea of when things were sort of synchronized or out-synchronized is kind of quite interesting, because sort of Phnom Penh was like 8 hours ahead of us. So there are areas where it was live, or it kind of worked on like kind of database, so it sort of pulled data out from the previous day. So you could also have interactions with sort of ghost avatars as well. What became sort of interesting with this piece of work was how people interacted on the play space and sort of worked around it when they knew it was like a live set of feet that are sort of following them around. So they can sort of see some of the interactions. You know, if you're close to somebody else in proximity in Phnom Penh and in the UK, it sort of draw a connection between you physically as like a node on this real-time floor. And this is like some early prototyping that I kind of built using processing to kind of just kind of get the software working. And then this is kind of a piece of work functioning. So as you sort of walked around the space, it kind of generated these kind of little blue avatars. It's also connected to Twitter as well. So when you sort of entered the gallery space, you kind of entered your kind of effective kind of needs and wants. This idea, if you had something in your pockets and you sort of had to leave somewhere, what do you sort of take with you? What is it do you sort of need to travel or to survive? So these kind of three things were kind of attached to your avatar, but also kind of posted on Twitter as well. So what kind of was interesting about it was kind of how people, this idea of sort of sentiment analysis, how people kind of, how you kind again, evaluate kind of what people prioritize. So the most common words were kind of like sort of sex, money, and love, what people kind of want. Key positive things were kind of like hope, escape, and transition, in kind of what people sort of generally sort of desired, or what sort of take with them as kind of part of that sort of journey. So this idea of emergent play is really interesting. How you sort of how the audience interacted and kind of made these kind of real-time narratives with other participants in the civil gallery space in Cambodia, and the sense of kind of ownership as well. When people sort of create this avatar with their words attached to it, there's a sense of ownership with it as well. Even though it's sort of digital, non-permanent, you know, when the installation was shut down, then that data would be lost. But during sort of the live period, people felt attached to kind of what they kind of created. But also how kind of people sort of interacted physically with their own kind of, you know, form in the real space and virtual space. So yeah, a few shots there of the exhibition nights. It ran for about 5-6 weeks, and surprisingly, the floor actually is pretty resilient, considering the amount of sort of traffic on top of it. And just this idea of having like a space that you could read as well as interacting is kind of quite interesting, as it kind of posted messages in parallel on social media as well as in the gallery space. So just kind of wrap up, just some things that have come from that. This idea of kind of, you know, playful interaction in emergent spaces is quite interesting. When you sort of put stuff, when you put kind of work like that into gallery space or public spaces, how the audiences kind of interact with it is kind of quite interesting. And it sort of evolves in interesting ways that you don't potentially always sort of design for. But also this idea of using technology as a platform to teach how you can hack this technology, how you can use it in kind of interesting ways, social ways. So again, these are all things that are kind of currently part of my research and further study. But I'll hand you back over now.
Thank you very much, Jay. That brought us a different aspect to what performance is and how people can be online and in person too as well. Okay, so then I'd like now to move to John Rose Adams, who comes from XR Stories. He can explain partly what that is, but he has funding available, so of interest to people, and he's funded a range of different projects through the XR Stories entity. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Anna. Can I be heard? Can you hear me all right? Brilliant. Okay, so I find myself
yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. I find myself somewhat of an imposter amongst such esteemed academics and creatives, because I'm actually not an interactive storyteller, but I do work with people who are, and I'm a producer on XR Stories, which is a vehicle for innovation in immersive and interactive storytelling, working out of Yorkshire. So what I've done, I've got the hive mind of XR Stories, which involves creatives, producers, academics, active researchers, to give me their top three. So top three things. I'm going to put these, and these are more like conditions for performance processes, I think. They're drawn mainly from like VR, mixed reality, and some AI-driven storytelling backgrounds. So the first, I'm going to, oh, my GIF's moving now. I'm going to move past it. Here we go. Okay. So the first one around conventions, right? So we should look when we're making something for the conventions that the audience are bringing with them, because they do bring them with them, and they bring them with them from theatres, traditional theatre, and from watching telly at home, and from playing video games at home, and from going to comedy clubs. And so when they buy their ticket or they enter into a transaction to come to see our thing, our interactive thing, they're bringing those conventions with them. And that's really important, because we have to have that. We have to have that in our knowledge when we start. So what happens, therefore, when an angry Steppenwolf from the Justice League breaks the fourth wall and asks you to take part in his mission and expects you and requires you to answer back meaningfully? And or what happens when you're confronted not with a theatre, with a stage, but a doorway, and an invitation to enter a virtual world through that doorway. These are two images from projects that we've recently done with Warner Media. The first, with Steppenwolf, was a project run by Charisma, who have a storytelling engine which powers interactive, conversational-based character stuff, and it's very powerful, and it remembers what you say, and it can change. You can change and shape the dialogue and the story arc with your voice or your your fingers if you're typing or whatever. And the second project, this doorway, is a project by Prox and Reverie, and with the combination of a high-end VR headset, you can be invited and enter through that doorway, that very doorway, a virtual world, and have character encounters with Adventure Time and Aquaman, and be a part of a virtual world. There's not many conventions that are set up for these things, so what do we do about it? So the next, sorry, that sort of leads on to what we've seen a lot of in our projects, which is an attention to the onboarding. Now, we're still firmly in a time when if you ask someone if you want a VR headset before, when you're about to put one on, they're as likely to say no as they are to say yes, particularly if you're trying to reach a broad audience. And this is important because they don't really know what they're letting themselves into, and we've got a really high duty of care to support people. So we know we need to do things. We need to make a player feel uncomfortable with the unknown. We need to support them throughout the whole thing. So during the gameplay, through the experience, and out the other side. So with that in mind, this is a still, so actually a composite screenshot from a project by Megaverse called Flood, which is it's a real-time live cast, full motion capture piece of theatre. The audience are in VR headsets, but co-present with the actors who are mocapped in the same space. The challenge for this performance is particularly around how to onboard an audience into the actual performance space. And the way Megaverse dealt with this is really interesting, I think. So they have the actors be the ones who greet the audience members on the way in. So before the performance started, the actors prepare them for the performance, enable them to put their VR headsets on, attach the trackers that you need on various parts of the body so that they're tracked accurately in the space, and checking that they're relaxed and whether they've done VR before and what to expect, leaving only little secrets and kind of not trying to spoil the overall experience. And during this, they're getting into character as well, and they slowly transition into character. So when the performance starts in the virtual world, the audience are involved with the actors. They actually know who they are and they're familiar. Their voices are familiar, and they see them in the virtual world. Front of house and technical crews, by the way, they're all there, but they're not got that hands-on thing with the actors. And I thought that was a really interesting way of like breaking down those barriers and getting people onboarded into that. And I think although that's about VR and free roam VR at that, I think the principle's the same about how you care about bringing the people into these interactive experiences so that they will hopefully do the interaction thing that you want them to do. And then one quick final observation, which I've called beautiful economy. And I think what I mean by this is that when you've got this vast expanded realm of possibility that digital worlds, 3D worlds represent, and interactive storytelling kind of suggests, building interactivity that's measured and subtle and enhances to a large extent the linear aspects of the story, it's often quite effective. And I want to give you an example of that done to beautiful effect. So this is a still from a project by Pilot Theatre. It's a project called Monoliths, in its final stages at the moment with us. And it features 3 poems, each written by women from Yorkshire, and draws from the diverse Yorkshire landscapes of moors, city, and seascape. And this is moors. On your screen. And the interaction design here is I think gives a good example of what I mean by beautiful economy. So the poets' voices and the sumptuous landscapes that you see in VR are the stars, the undisputed stars of the show. But you're there, you're present in VR, so you want to have some sort of active agency. So you as the viewer, you're given measured intervals throughout the pieces, objects to hold in your hands that are referenced by the poetry, and you're encouraged to explore to a certain extent the environments around, but not be majorly sort of active. And it's meditative and it's transportive, and that's the intent of the piece. It's absolutely fab, and it's beautiful economy. So they were my 3 points, Anna. I've been very brief, I hope. But if you get a chance to anybody, check out those 4 creators that I've name checked because they're all incredible, and we'll share links. So Charisma, Prox and Reverie, Pilot Theatre, and Megaverse, because they're all brilliant.
Thank you very much, John. They're really interesting uses of performance characteristics Okay, so finally, we come to David Negrin, moving out of Yorkshire. David is a screenwriter, a game designer, a VR director. There's nothing this man can't do. And he's also a teacher and has been part of many workshops and his own companies. And he's going to talk about VR and VR stories. Okay, thanks. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Anna. Let me just bring up my screen here. Yeah, I'm a professor, game designer, VR creator, a game consulting producer. Today, I want to talk to you guys about VR stories versus stories in VR. We could adapt any film, any novel, any narrative to a VR experience, but it doesn't necessarily make it a organic VR experience, right? So I wanted to talk a little bit about the kinds of stories that call for VR. So a story that is enhanced by putting it in an immersive virtual reality experience. And then I'm going to show you a great example of one. First of all, true stories are something that always raises our levels of awareness in terms of our own senses of self-preservation and the fight or flight responses. When you see a true story, whether it's a documentary or a fictionalized version of a true story, part of the brain is always asking yourself, okay, this is helping me prepare for a similar emergency situation if that happened to me. And so something that has a true story basis, or at least emulates a real world possible experience, versus something purely fiction that might be very fantastical. I mean, I love fantasy and I love science fiction, but VR can really pull out the heart of what getting immersed in experiences, when we know that there's some kind of real world benefit to it. In terms of concepts that invoke dream state-like experiences, anything that from literal dreams and human fantasies to traumatic experience to shock experiences, they alter our state and become extremely immersive in highly sensory experiences. So any story that involves that kind of thing. Stories that have story beats that involve the senses organically, where we're not bringing in music or bringing in visuals that feel they're more organic because they don't feel artificial, right? Things that are visually interesting and novel environments. VR is an opportunity to transport people, to create transportative settings, take us to places we've never seen before, or inside a place that we could never go. This makes a story even more suitable for VR. Also, poetic writing, metaphor, similes, magical realism, again, dreams. These are opportunities to show what VR can really do in storytelling. And as always, with interactive experiences, when the character has choices that involve physical actions or other actions that involve our senses. So the experience I wanted to tell you guys about is one that I'm just really obsessed with. It's called On the Morning You Wake to the End of the World. The premise is related to an actual event in 2018 where an alert was issued by the state of Hawaii, mentioning that there was going to be a ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii, and that everyone should seek immediate shelter, and that it was not a drill, it was not a test. People got this on their phones in the emergency format. And it turned out not to be true. It turned out to be false, right? But the experience of receiving that message is the premise for On the Morning You Wake, the VR experience. This is the team behind it: Mike Brett, Steve Jameson, Dr. Osorio, Arnaud Colinar, Pierre Zanjowicz. And so to me, this experience, this VR experience is exactly what I'm talking about when we talk about an experience that requires VR or that calls for VR. And I'm going to play the trailer without the audio so I could talk about it. But essentially what I was getting at was this idea of an experience that is so immersive or so dreamlike that it requires an immersive experience to tell the story. The idea that you could receive a message that would change your life instantly, that you could receive a phone message and then all of a sudden you panic. You think about your loved ones. You're in a total fight or flight experience, right? And it's like a mind-altering experience. You change, whatever you were working on or whatever you were doing before. You're now immersed in an emergency, a life-threatening emergency. And so the artists behind this VR experience are trying to simulate that and reproduce that, showing us, again, transportative visuals, along with things we can't imagine, apocalyptic actual undertakings, apocalyptic events, things that no one has ever experienced and survived, a nuclear attack, right? So On the Morning You Wake, To the End of the World, from the people who brought us Notes on Blindness. Notes on Blindness is actually a really great example of yet another VR experience that requires VR, right? So like Notes on Blindness is about losing your sight, and the idea of losing your sight, again, is one of these experiences that is both invokes a dreamlike state and uses senses organically. In addition, On the Morning You Wake has an impact campaign. As a game designer for social impact and someone who cares about impact, I'm always attracted to projects that have an impact dimension to them. The campaign reframes the threat from nuclear weapons as an urgent social justice issue relevant to the fight against systemic oppression around the world. So, to me, it's, as storytellers, as writers, we should be looking to use the tool that enhances the story, not just adapting a story that is already popular to VR. It's what are stories that will thrive in VR, will sublimate in VR, will become greater than the sum of its parts. And that's what I have for you today. And this is my information on my campsite, if anyone wants to get in contact.
Thank you very much. That's great. Can we have all the participants up perchance? I think essentially different speakers here have talked about different elements of performance and participation, and ways in which the audience is integral, to interactive storytelling. I think it brings us back yet again to where we started today with Yoko Taro's observations of, how do we create emotion? How do we make people feel safe? How do we bring them in? How do we make them feel at home? And so that they can then take part and contribute. And each of these examples just kind of gives us a different way in. I'm just wondering if there's any questions. It'd be interesting to see any questions from, right, we do have some questions. And maybe this one, it could be for you, Che, but it could be for everybody, but we start with you. Geolocated stories are an interesting idea, but not many seem to work to make a good experience for the audience. Do you know ones that do, or does anybody know ones that do?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, you've seen, I mean, I think you sort of see that in one sort of the gaming sector, and like Pokemon Go, obviously, it's like the kind of the big winner. It's not so much an art piece, but it's certainly a social piece, isn't it? In terms of how it's brought communities together, and it kind of had its kind of high point, what, year and a half, 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, peaked. But yeah, that's probably one of the kind of biggest commercial successes of an application of sort of a geolocation and sort of gameplay, I think, in an accessible and social space. So I think that projects like that are interesting. I think, you know, in terms of how that can be exploited, I think there's still a lot to be done in terms of using the language of that medium in interesting ways that we still look at an early stage at, and exploiting that and exploiting the material of those technologies beyond it kind of just being like a mobile hotspot. How do you sort of use it as a way to kind of to draw the public together, or kind of communities together? And we sort of see gaming doing that is in that kind of space more so than other areas. So I think that's an interesting kind of sort of application of it in most recent years, I think.
Yeah, great, thanks. And has anybody else got any suggestions? Alex, have you?
Yeah, a Leeds-based group called Closed Forum were just before the pandemic hit. They were working on a project for Leeds City Centre, which used, I think, a twine mechanism and geolocation to cast you as the player as an investigative journalist, and depending on which bits of the city you were in, you could gather different bits of evidence from the story. And I don't know actually if they ever got to present the finished version because of the pandemic, but that hopefully that will get staged at some point. But it looked, I just saw like a really early demo of it, and it looked really interesting.
Yeah, I think those opportunities where you can mix live with, you know, something that's online might work more effectively. I think it's when we become aware of the technology really and what's happening. Although again, having said that, the Dream one from the RSC did show us all the technology, and that really engaged everybody. So it's not always the case that it has to be kind of seamless in that way. Okay, there's another question. And this one may be for you, David. Are there any historical stories that would adapt well into VR based on similar principles?
Absolutely. I think I know a friend of mine is doing a VR experience around the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which is, you know, an awful, a tragic piece of history from New York City history, where some of the elements of the mystery are still unsolved. Some of the elements of the crime are still very well understood. But because it happened in a time when there wasn't television, and there are some photographs, I think it's a great example of a story that was true that no one has seen other than the people who were there at the time. That it's a mystery that has to do with you know, the exits being blocked and the fire spreading, and most of the workers being women, and you know, we haven't seen it because there isn't footage of it. And so creating a VR experience of that could bring us a documentary experience of something like that historical event.
Sorry, I forgot I was muted. Has anybody else got any suggestions about what's effective in VR?
I think David nailed it with his bullet point list of those things that are effective. And it's really, I was working down projects with VR projects we've been involved in, kind of going, yes, oh, we missed that one. Yes, that one's good. So it was really useful actually, and just to kind of play those through. Yeah.
Yeah, I think history. So when we saw the documentary that Peter Jackson did, where he colorized a lot of the war footage, he helped sort of bringing color and editing and bringing the footage into higher resolution filmmaking. He helped bring a historic experience to us that we'd not seen before. And but he did have footage to begin with. If we have no footage of historical events, but we have the information, and if you're interested in documentary storytelling, if you're interested in telling true stories, this is a great place to start. We all read about different historical events that we have no footage of. So start with an experience that your audience may have heard about, and so you have a built-in audience, but we don't have any footage of yet. So that's a great VR experience waiting to happen.
Okay, and a further question, again on VR. VR experiences often seem to put the audience into a bubble. How can those experiences expand, become more interactive? David, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the VR experience, on whether it's meant to be interactive or it's meant to be an immersive cinema experience. I think there are plenty of VR experiences that, have you ever played, like Hot, the shooting one, right? Like, or if you've played a VR version of Beat Saber, it's extremely interactive. But it has to be built in. It's part of the game design precepts to manage both the storytelling and the interactive choices. This is the central question and challenge of VR creators, is how to tell a story, but also give your audience choices in terms of story choices, but also interactive choices. I think that the problem with a bubble, I think the hardware is still a little oppressive. It's still early in the days. One of the problems with VR is still you get fatigued after like 20 minutes or 30 minutes, even on the best headsets. So maybe it can feel a little claustrophobic. But I'll remind you that when we go to movie theaters, we're turning off all of our senses. We're trying to immerse ourselves. A movie theater experience is very much like putting on a set of goggles because we want the lights off, we want the sound overwhelming us. So we ask for that. It's just how you execute it.
Sorry, did you want to come in, Jay?
Yeah, I was thinking about something recently. Is it called Colossus? It could be mistaken, I'll find it. But I think it's kind of playing around with perspective, I think, as well as an interesting thing, because I think this idea of being in the bubble, a lot of it's kind of to do with the hardware limitations and how it's kind of shot and how it's filmed. But when you start exploring the kind of the boundaries of what you can sort of see, I think through the software or the hardware, I think that's kind of an interesting way to break that illusion. I think, certainly I think when you go with the expectation of experiencing VR in a certain way, you kind of get locked into that almost. So I think artists and documentary makers can sort of play with those notions, those kind of ideas in interesting ways. And again, that stuff's kind of been explored. And you find it being implemented kind of more naturally now. But it's also what you mentioned previously, this kind of idea of sort of seamless experience, and finding a way to do that without it being a way to kind of draw attention away from technology. And that's always kind of a difficult thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm afraid we have to finish there. But thank you very much for bringing these ideas about performance. And I think the whole VR debate is just sort of opening up. And I'll hand back now.